From the moment I was born, my father had already mapped out the early trajectory of my life. That early trajectory for my father has to include Penang Free School, the school that he went to and my grandfather went to. And so at the age of 13, yes, I did find my way into Penang Free School, and I remember thinking, what's the big deal? So I am at Penang Free School. And at Penang Free School, I learned that we were all assigned into different sports houses. Sports houses is like in, Harry Potter, we have Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, and like that. And in Penang Free School, originally there were 5 sports houses, and I learned from my friend S.S. Kua that this idea of sports houses goes back to 1928, and it was created by then headmaster David R. Swain, who created those 5 original sports houses, and the original 5 were Hargreaves, Pinhorn, Hamilton, Cheeseman, and Wu Lien-teh. Wu Lien-teh? When I hear the name Wu Lien-teh, for sure it sounds very Chinese, and how does this Wu Lien-teh fit into these sports houses? And I later learned that Wu Lien-teh is the only one who isn't a headmaster of Penang Free School. All the other 4 were named after Penang Free School headmasters. But why Wu Lien-teh, and who is this Wu Lien-teh? I later learned that it's because of the high regard that headmaster David Swain had for Wu Lien-teh that he assigned the sports house to Wu Lien-teh. And so this is my introduction to this figure who, as time passed by, I began to appreciate and realize what a towering figure he is in Penang that so few people know about. And even today, some people might have heard of the name Wu Lien-teh, and if you are from Penang Free School, for sure you might even be in the Wu Lien-teh sports house. And so begins this journey to discover that this Wu Lien-teh is a man who changed medical history, and in today's video we are going to learn about how he did it. Prologue: The Man Who Fought Death. The year was 1910. Winter had turned the plains of Manchuria into a frozen wasteland. In town after town, death arrived without warning, men and women coughing blood, collapsing in the snow, and dying within hours. Bodies piled high in the streets, while the bitter wind carried the scent of fear. The imperial government of China was desperate. Foreign doctors fled the epidemic, terrified of infection. Entire villages vanished overnight, and then came a call, not for a general or a soldier, but for a doctor. A young man arrived from Tianjin, barely 30 years old, wearing round spectacles and carrying a small black case. His name was Wu Lien-teh, a doctor born not in Beijing or Shanghai, but in Penang, a small British colony thousands of miles away. What he discovered in Manchuria would change the course of medicine forever. Through courage, logic, and science, Wu confronted one of the deadliest outbreaks the modern world had ever seen, the Manchurian pneumonic plague, and triumphed where entire empires had failed. His invention, a simple gauze and cotton mask, would save countless lives and later become the ancestor of the modern surgical and N95 masks we use today. He was not only a physician, he was a bridge between worlds, East and West, tradition and science, despair and hope. How did a young doctor from colonial Penang become the man who stopped a plague and reshaped the future of medicine? To answer that, we must return to where it all began, to the narrow streets of Georgetown, where a bright-eyed boy first dared to dream of curing the world. Chapter 1. A Son of Penang. What shapes a healer, birth, hardship, or destiny itself? In the bustling port city of Georgetown, Penang, amid the clatter of trishaws and spice-laden air, a child was born in 1879 to a family of modest means. His name was Wu Lien-teh, the second son of a Chinese immigrant from Taishan in Guangdong province who had come seeking a better life in British Malaya. The Wu family lived near Bridge Street in a community of hard-working Chinese merchants and craftsmen. His father ran a small business, while his mother managed the household and taught her children the Confucian virtues of diligence, humility, and filial piety. From a young age, Liándé stood out not for wealth, but for intellect. At Penang Free School, one of the finest English medium institutions in the Straits Settlements, young Wu excelled in every subject. His teachers described him as brilliant, quiet, and determined. He absorbed languages with ease, English, Malay, and Chinese, and devoured books on science, history, and philosophy. Penang at the turn of the century was a crossroads of the world. British administrators, Indian traders, Chinese scholars, and Malay fishermen all shared its streets. Growing up in such a cosmopolitan world gave Wu a rare perspective. He learned to think beyond boundaries, to see the power of both Eastern wisdom and Western knowledge. But education for a Chinese boy in colonial Malaya was a privilege, one often limited by race and wealth. His family's resources were stretched thin, yet through sheer brilliance and perseverance, Wu won a Queen's Scholarship, one of the highest academic honors in the British Empire. It was a ticket that would take him from Penang's sunlit shores to the cold lecture halls of Cambridge University. As he prepared to leave for England, his mother reportedly told him, "Go and learn all you can, but never forget where you come from." Her words would follow him all his life. How far can one mind travel when driven by both purpose and promise? In the next chapter, that young scholar boards a ship bound for Britain, where he would confront prejudice, earn distinction, and lay the foundations of a career that would change the world. Chapter 2. Scholar of the Empire. What happens when a young man from the tropics steps into the heart of an empire that does not yet see him as equal? At just 19, Wu Lien-teh boarded a ship bound for England, the journey financed by his Queen's Scholarship, a rare honor that only the brightest colonial students could attain. After weeks at sea, he arrived in the fog-draped city of Cambridge, where horse carriages rolled past stone towers older than his homeland. He enrolled at Emmanuel College, University of Cambridge, to study medicine, becoming one of the first active Chinese students ever to do so. Yet, despite the prestige, his life there was far from easy. Racial prejudice simmered beneath polite manners. Wu was often the only Asian in lecture halls, enduring the stares of peers who doubted that a boy from Penang could match their intellect. But Wu was undeterred. He immersed himself in anatomy, pathology, and bacteriology, the very frontiers of modern science. The late 19th century was an age of medical revolution. Louis Pasteur's germ theory was transforming understanding of disease, while Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods were saving lives in operating rooms. Wu absorbed it all, determined to bring his knowledge back to Asia. In 1902, he graduated with a Bachelor of Medicine and was awarded the prestigious Gold Medal in Medicine and Surgery. He later continued postgraduate studies at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and at the St Mary's Hospital in London, where he worked under Sir M. Rolfe Wright, a pioneer in vaccine research. It was during these years that Wu's worldview expanded beyond medicine. Living in Britain exposed him to new ideas, from constitutional reforms to the rise of colonized peoples. He began to see that healing was not only a matter of curing disease, but also of curing ignorance and injustice. He became known among his professors as the Penang scholar who never wasted an hour. His diligence earned him admiration even from those who had once dismissed him. By the time he completed his training, Wu Lien-teh had achieved something extraordinary. He had bridged East and West, mastering the scientific tools of modern Europe while remaining deeply grounded in his Chinese roots. But just as his future in Britain seemed bright, a longing stirred within him, the desire to return home to serve his people. What drives a man to turn his back on comfort and return to a world still battling poverty and superstition? In the next chapter, Wu Lien-teh sails back to Malaya, bringing with him not only the knowledge of the West, but the conviction that medicine could transform his homeland. Chapter 3. Return to Malaya. When Wu Lien-teh completed his medical studies at Cambridge, he stood at the pinnacle of achievement, a young man from a small colonial island who had conquered the heights of British academia. Yet, even with his qualifications and honors, the path home was not paved with ease. In the early 1900s, British Malaya was still a land of colonial hierarchies, and opportunities for a Chinese doctor were limited. Upon returning to Penang, Wu found that despite his credentials, the colonial administration offered little recognition. Positions of influence were reserved for Europeans, and even local medical roles were restricted by race. Determined to serve his community, Wu joined the Institute for Medical Research in Kuala Lumpur, then newly established, to focus on tropical diseases that plagued the local population. But soon, his independent spirit and outspoken criticism of opium abuse among the Chinese community drew the ire of the colonial government. In 1907, Wu published a paper condemning the social and medical consequences of opium smoking. The report, bold for its time, was seen as a direct challenge to British economic interests since opium was heavily taxed and profitable. Wu's moral conviction and unwillingness to remain silent cost him dearly. His government position was terminated. Disillusioned but unbroken, Wu returned to private practice in Penang. There, he continued his medical work among ordinary people, gaining respect as a physician who treated both rich and poor. It was a quieter phase in his life, yet one that deepened his compassion and sharpened his purpose. He was no longer simply a scholar of science, he was becoming a doctor of the people. Then, in 1910, a message would arrive from far across the sea. A deadly plague had erupted in the northeastern provinces of China. The Qing government, desperate for help, sought a man of both Western medical training and Chinese heritage. That man was Dr. Wu Lien-teh. The call of destiny had come. Chapter 4. A Call from China. In the winter of 1910, as the snow fell upon the plains of Manchuria, a silent killer was sweeping through the border towns. A mysterious plague, fast, merciless, and deadly, was claiming thousands of lives. Panic spread as bodies piled up in the streets and entire communities were quarantined or abandoned. The Qing imperial court, overwhelmed and desperate, sought someone who could bring both scientific expertise and cultural understanding to confront the catastrophe. That man was Dr. Wu Lien-teh. At just 31 years old, he received a telegram summoning him to Harbin. The mission was daunting: to identify the cause of the outbreak and stop its spread before it reached the heart of China. Few doctors dared to go, most who did never returned alive. Yet Wu accepted without hesitation. It was more than a professional duty, it was a call of conscience, a moment when East and West would meet through one man's resolve. When Wu arrived in Harbin in December of 1910, he faced a grim scene. The frozen landscape was littered with corpses, and fear had paralyzed both officials and residents. The disease was so virulent that victims died within days, coughing blood before collapsing. Many assumed it was bubonic plague spread by rats as in past epidemics, but Wu suspected something far more dangerous. With limited resources, he began meticulous autopsies, something unprecedented in China at the time and deeply taboo in Confucian culture. Yet his courage to challenge tradition revealed the truth. The plague was pneumonic, spread through the air by droplets from human to human. It was the first major airborne epidemic known to modern science. Dr. Wu's discovery changed everything, but knowing the cause was only the beginning. The question now was, could this young doctor from Penang find a way to stop the deadliest epidemic China has ever faced? Chapter 5: The Manchurian Plague. The winter of 1910-1911 in Manchuria was one of terror. The deadly pneumonic plague spread with frightening speed, killing nearly everyone it touches within 48 hours. Entire towns were silenced, trains full of corpses arrived from the north, and Harbin railway hub was on the brink of collapse. Dr. Wu Lien-teh worked around the clock, often without sleep, meticulously studying the disease in makeshift laboratories. He confirmed that the plague was airborne, transmitted through droplets expelled by coughing and sneezing. This discovery was groundbreaking, but it also demanded a radical new approach to containment. Acting swiftly, Wu ordered the isolation of patients, the sealing off of infected areas, and the cremation of plague victims' bodies to prevent further spread. These measures were shocking to local officials and even drew resistance from traditionalists who viewed cremation as a desecration of the dead. Yet Wu stood firm, explaining that saving the living must take precedence over preserving custom. Perhaps his most significant innovation was the creation of the modern medical face mask. Adapting the principles of surgical gauze, he designed a simple yet effective mask made of layers of cotton and gauze, secured with ties to cover the nose and mouth. It became a crucial barrier for doctors, nurses, and citizens, and the forerunner of the mask used globally today. Despite these efforts, the struggle was immense. Foreign doctors, including Russians and Japanese, arrived to offer assistance, but some doubted Wu's authority, seeing him merely as a colonial subject of British Malaya. One French physician even defied his quarantine orders, entering a restricted area without a mask. Within days, he contracted the plague and died, an event that silenced Wu's critics and proved the accuracy of his methods. By the spring of 1911, the tide began to turn. Through strict quarantine, cremation, and public health education, the plague was finally contained. Over 60,000 lives had been lost, but millions more were saved. From the chaos of Manchuria emerged a new respect from science, and for a doctor from Penang who had bridged two worlds. Dr. Wu's success not only ended the epidemic, it marked the dawn of modern public health in China. Chapter 6: Containing the Crisis. How does one restore order to a land haunted by invisible death? For Dr. Wu Lien-teh, the Manchurian plague was not only a battle against disease, it was a test of leadership, science, and faith in reason. By early 1911, his emergency health measures were in full effect. Harbin, once a city of chaos, became a model of coordination. Quarantine zones were enforced with military precision, train travel was suspended, and every incoming passenger was examined for fever and cough. Dr. Wu personally supervised the establishment of hospitals and inspection stations, drafting over 2,000 workers to disinfect homes and streets. His motto was simple yet revolutionary for China at the time: prevention is better than cure. He issued daily bulletins explaining the necessity of masks, hygiene, and cremation. When the spring thaw threatened to unleash a new wave of infection from unburied bodies, Wu persuaded the Qing governor to approve the mass cremation of over 3,000 corpses, an act unheard of in Chinese tradition. The ceremony, solemn and respectful, marked a turning point in China's confrontation with modern science. To ensure long-term safety, Wu organized the International Plague Conference in Mukden, today's Shenyang, in April 1911. 22 leading scientists and medical officers from around the world attended, the first such conference ever held in Asia. There, Dr. Wu presented his findings that the Manchurian plague was pneumonic, transmitted from person to person through airborne droplets rather than from rats or fleas as previously believed. His presentation, supported by data and autopsy results, changed the world's understanding of infectious disease. The success of the conference earned Dr. Wu the respect of both foreign and Chinese governments. The Qing authorities appointed him Chief Medical Officer for the region, and he was granted resources to establish the North Manchurian Plague Prevention Service, China's first modern public health institution. What began as a desperate response had evolved into a movement of reform. Wu's victory over the plague not only saved lives, but demonstrated the power of science to unite nations. In the ruins of Manchuria's tragedy, he had built the foundation of a healthier, more modern China. Chapter 7: Reforming Chinese Medicine. What happens when tradition meets the relentless force of modern science? For Dr. Wu Lien-teh, the end of the Manchurian plague was not the end of his mission, it was only the beginning. Having earned international acclaim, Wu now turned his focus to transforming China's entire approach to medicine. In 1912, following the fall of the Qing dynasty, the newly formed Republic of China invited him to Beijing to serve as director of the National Quarantine Service. There, he became the driving force behind the establishment of modern hospitals, laboratories, and medical schools, introducing Western clinical methods into a nation still dominated by traditional practices. Dr. Wu did not oppose traditional Chinese medicine outright. He respected its history and cultural significance. Yet, he believed that without scientific validation and public health infrastructure, China would remain vulnerable to epidemics. He once wrote, "The future of Chinese medicine must lie not in superstition, but in knowledge, discipline, and proof." In 1915, he founded the Chinese Medical Association, which became the cornerstone of modern medical professionalism in China. Through it, he promoted the licensing of physicians, standardization of treatments, and publication of medical research in both English and Chinese. His leadership helped bridge the gap between East and West, bringing scientific medicine to China while also giving China a voice in international medical circles. He also introduced new health measures that many take for granted today: vaccination programs, public sanitation campaigns, and epidemic surveillance systems. He trained doctors and nurses from across China, insisting that medicine must serve the people, not merely the privileged. But reform did not come without resistance. Traditional practitioners accused him of betraying Chinese heritage, bureaucrats resented his independence, and foreign powers, suspicious of a rising Chinese expert, sometimes questioned his authority. Yet Wu pressed on. He believed that saving lives was a higher duty than appeasing pride. By the 1920s, his influence had spread beyond medicine. Dr. Wu had become a symbol of modern Chinese progress, proof that knowledge, when paired with courage, could reshape a civilization. Chapter 8: Between Empires and Revolutions. What does it mean to heal a nation that is itself in turmoil? As China entered the turbulent decades of the 1920s and 1930s, Dr. Wu Lien-teh found himself working amid shifting governments, foreign encroachments, and revolutionary change. Yet even as the world around him fractured, his commitment to medicine and public health never wavered. In the aftermath of the Qing dynasty's collapse, Dr. Wu served under successive regimes, warlords, nationalists, and regional authorities, each with their own politics and suspicions. Still, they relied on his expertise. He was appointed to lead China's Northeast Bureau of Health, where he established quarantine systems, improved water supplies, and set up disease monitoring stations along trade routes. His aim was to build resilience against future epidemics, not just in cities, but in rural communities where poverty and illness were rampant. Dr. Wu's scientific stature also made him China's face in the global medical community. In 1930, he represented China at the League of Nations International Health Conference in Geneva, becoming one of the first Chinese physicians to engage the West as an equal in public health dialogue. He spoke passionately about preventive medicine, vaccination, and education as tools for national strength. His speech, delivered in fluent English, earned him widespread respect and helped redefine how the world saw Chinese science. At home, however, China's internal struggles continued to frustrate reform. Political instability, lack of funding, and regional rivalries often undermined his initiatives. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was a particularly bitter blow. The region he had helped modernize, Harbin, the very city where he once defeated the plague, fell under occupation. Many of his institutions were dismantled and repurposed. Dr. Wu remained in China for several more years, trying to maintain his health programs despite the chaos. Yet, he increasingly saw that his battle was no longer just against disease, but against the forces of war and division. How does a healer keep faith when nations are bleeding? For Wu Lien-teh, the answer was simple: by continuing to heal one life at a time. Chapter 9: recognition and the Nobel nomination. Can one doctor's fight against disease echo all the way to Stockholm? By the mid-1930s, Dr. Wu Lien-teh had become a household name in both China and abroad. His pioneering work in epidemiology, his leadership during the Manchurian plague, and his unwavering dedication to public health had earned him respect from scientists across continents. For a man born in Penang, far from the centers of imperial science, his rise was nothing short of extraordinary. In 1935, his achievements culminated in something few could have imagined. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, the first and to this day one of the very few Malaysians of Chinese-born physicians to receive such recognition. Although he did not win, the nomination itself spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement not only of his brilliance, but of the growing legitimacy of Chinese medical science in the eyes of the world. The nomination cited his innovative use of epidemic control techniques, such as the gauze and cotton face mask, a simple but revolutionary idea that would later inspire the modern surgical mask. His insistence on autopsies, disinfection, and quarantine zones had set a new standard in global health responses. In an era before antibiotics, Dr. Wu's method saved tens of thousands of lives and became templates for future plague and influenza containment. Despite his international stature, Wu remained humble and deeply reflective. He saw the Nobel recognition not as personal glory, but as validation for Asian science and for every Chinese doctor striving to modernize medicine. He once wrote, "The fight against disease knows no race nor boundary. Truth and compassion are the true physicians of mankind." After the Nobel nomination, Dr. Wu continued to serve in key medical advisory roles, teaching younger generations of Chinese doctors and public health officers. He published numerous papers, including his monumental Plague Fighter, the autobiography of a modern Chinese physician, chronicling both his scientific battles and his dream of a healthier, enlightened China. Yet even as accolades poured in, dark clouds loomed on the horizon. The winds of war were rising again, and soon the doctor who had fought death itself would be forced to flee from its advance. Chapter 10: War and Exile. What becomes of a healer when the world itself falls ill? By the late 1930s, Dr. Wu Lien-teh had become one of the most respected figures in Chinese science. But his beloved homeland was again in turmoil. In 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted, bringing death and devastation to the cities and towns where he had once built hospitals and laboratories. The institutions he had founded, symbols of China's progress, now lay in the path of invasion. Wu, then in his early 60s, was faced with an agonizing choice: remain in a country descending into chaos or seek refuge to continue his work elsewhere. Reluctantly, he left China with his family, returning to Malaya, the land of his birth. It was an exile of necessity, not desire. The man who had once organized national health systems now found himself starting over, a private physician in a quiet colonial outpost far from the epicenter of his fame. Settling first in Ipoh, then later in Penang, Dr. Wu resumed medical practice, treating patients, mentoring young doctors, and occasionally lecturing on hygiene and epidemiology. Though he was far from the great laboratories and universities, he never stopped writing or researching. His home became a gathering place for scholars, community leaders, and students eager to hear his reflections on science, ethics, and the meaning of service. Even in the face of war, his compassion never waned. During the Japanese occupation of Malaya, 1941 to 1945, Wu's reputation as a doctor and his gentle, apolitical nature protected him from harm. He treated civilians on both sides of the conflict, refusing to let politics cloud his duty as a healer. Many who met him during those years described him as serene and unshaken, a man who had seen humanity at its worst and still chose to believe in its goodness. When the war ended, Wu was already an old man, but his mind remained sharp. He turned increasingly toward writing, documenting his scientific findings and chronicling the evolution of modern medicine in China. His memoir, Plague Fighter, published in 1959, offered not only the story of one man's struggle against disease, but also a meditation on perseverance and purpose in turbulent times. In exile, he had lost his laboratories, his official post, and his influence. Yet what remained was perhaps greater, a legacy of wisdom, humility, and devotion to humanity. He had once fought plague in the freezing plains of Manchuria. Now, in the tropical calm of Penang, he fought the slow decline of age with the same quiet dignity. As the world entered the atomic age, few remembered the Penang-born doctor who had once changed the course of medical history. But for those who knew his story, Dr. Wu Lien-teh was still the man who had faced death and taught the world how to live. Chapter 11: The Final Years. What becomes of a man who had lived 3 lifetimes in one? By the time Dr. Wu Lien-teh returned to Malaya after the Second World War, he was already a living legend, a physician whose mask had saved millions, a reformer who had modernized China's medical system, and a bridge between East and West. Yet, the twilight years of his life were spent far from the corridors of power or the laboratories of fame. In Penang, Wu lived quietly in a modest home, surrounded by family and the tropical tranquility of his birthplace. His days were filled with writing, reflection, and the occasional visit from students, admirers, and old friends who came seeking advice or inspiration. Though frail in body, his mind remained sharp and his humility as radiant as ever. He took no pride in honors or titles, only in the simple acknowledgement that his work had made a difference. During this period, Wu also began composing his autobiography, Plague Fighter, the autobiography of a modern Chinese physician, published in 1959. It offered a rare window into his remarkable journey from a struggling Chinese boy in Penang to an international figure who changed the course of medical history. The book reflected both his scientific precision and his deep humanity, capturing the struggles of a man who had often stood alone against skepticism, politics, and disease. Even in his retirement, Wu's influence endured. Medical professionals across Asia continue to cite his pioneering principles in public health and epidemiology. His advocacy for quarantine measures, contact tracing, and mask wearing, ideas once ridiculed, became fundamental to modern infectious disease control. In many ways, the world only began to understand the depth of his foresight decades after his passing. On January 21, 1960, Dr. Wu Lien-teh passed away peacefully at the age of 80, leaving behind a legacy far greater than most could comprehend. He was laid to rest in the Mount Erskine Cemetery in Penang, his tombstone engraved with quiet simplicity, befitting the man who had fought death itself with reason, compassion, and courage. His death marked the end of an era, but his story was far from forgotten. In China, he was celebrated as the father of modern public health. In Penang, as one of the island's greatest sons, and around the world as a pioneer whose ideas still shape how humanity responds to pandemics today. As one admirer wrote shortly after his passing, Dr. Wu Lien-teh did not conquer nations or rule empires. He conquered death and taught mankind how to live. Chapter 12: Legacy of a Healer. What defines a legacy? The discoveries one makes or the lives one saves? For Dr. Wu Lien-teh, it was both. His work transcended the laboratories and hospital wards, shaping the very way nations respond to disease. Long after his passing, the principles he championed, epidemiology, hygiene, vaccination, and international collaboration, remain the bedrock of modern public health. Wu's most enduring contribution lay in the concept of disease prevention through organized response. Before him, epidemics were often seen as acts of fate or divine punishment. Wu transformed that perception. He demonstrated that through scientific investigation, quarantine, and public education, even the deadliest outbreaks could be contained. The protocols he established during the Manchurian plague of 1910-1911 later became templates for the control of SARS, avian flu, and even COVID-19 more than a century later. In a sense, every modern epidemic response carries his intellectual fingerprint. His insistence on cross-border medical cooperation was equally visionary. Wu's leadership at the International Plague Conference of 1911 marked China's debut on the global scientific stage. For the first time, Chinese physicians and scientists engaged their Western counterparts as equals. Wu showed that knowledge need not flow in only one direction, from west to east, but could circulate freely for the good of all humanity. Wu's influence also reached into education. He established modern medical schools, trained a generation of Chinese doctors, and advocated the professionalization of medicine in China. Many of his proteges later became leaders in hospitals, universities, and government ministries. Through them, his ideas endured, evolving with the times but never losing their relevance. Yet, his legacy extends beyond science. For overseas Chinese, Wu became a symbol of pride, a Penang-born son of the Straits who rose to global prominence without ever forgetting his roots. He embodied the cosmopolitan Chinese identity of the early 20th century, grounded in Chinese tradition, educated in the West, and dedicated to serving humanity. Today, monuments, museums, and institutions across China, Malaysia, and beyond honor his name. In Harbin, a museum stands where he once fought the plague. In Penang, scholars and doctors remember him as a pioneer who bridged worlds. But perhaps his true memorial lies in every life saved by the mask, the quarantine, and the idea that medicine is not only a science, but also a moral duty. Epilogue: The Penang Doctor Who Changed the World. What does it take for one person to change the course of history? For Dr. Wu Lien-teh, it began with a simple conviction that science could serve humanity. From the narrow streets of Georgetown, Penang, to the frozen plains of Manchuria, his journey was one of intellect, courage, and compassion. Wu's story is not merely that of a doctor combating disease. It is the story of a world in transition. Born into a time when the British Empire still ruled the seas and the Qing dynasty struggled to modernize, Wu stood at the crossroads of East and West. He carried with him the discipline of Western medicine and the moral grounding of Chinese values. At a time when China was dismissed as backward, Wu proved that Chinese intellect and leadership could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best minds of the modern world. When the Manchurian plague struck in 1910, the world watched as an invisible enemy swept across northern China. Against overwhelming odds, Wu confronted not just the pathogen but also ignorance, prejudice, and bureaucracy. His decisive actions, quarantines, cremations, and the use of protective masks saved countless lives and set a precedent that endures to this day. The humble cotton and gauze mask he designed became the ancestor of the N95 respirator a century before the COVID-19 pandemic made it a global necessity. Wu's life was also a meditation on belonging. Though he served China with unshakable loyalty, he remained a son of Penang, an heir to the island's multicultural spirit. His success gave pride to generations of overseas Chinese who saw in him a reflection of themselves, rooted in Asia yet connected to the world. His name became a bridge between civilizations, his career a dialogue between science and humanity. When Wu passed away in 1960, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires had fallen, new nations had risen, and medicine had advanced into realms once unimaginable. Yet his legacy endured, not in monuments of stone, but in the living fabric of public health, in every hospital that follows his methods, in every doctor who dons a mask to protect others. Today, as humanity continues to battle new diseases, the wisdom of Dr. Wu Lien-teh still resonates. His life reminds us that progress is born from empathy and that even one doctor from a small island can change the destiny of millions. He was and remains the Penang doctor who changed the world.